Episode 1. Out of the ground and onto the table. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. The very first topic I will cover is not even a food. It's iron. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. This look at the role of iron in 17th century food will have 3 parts. Like many areas I will explore, there's so much about how iron has shaped American food that I cannot, nor do I want to pack it into one giant jumbled episode. Instead, I'm breaking it up into more reasonable and I think more interesting chunks. So I'm starting with how American food got some of its permanent shape because we grew and cooked it using iron right from the start. America, even as a colonial concern, is so young. Okay, how young is it? It is so young that iron pots and skillets and grates and spits and hoes and plows and so many things have always been a part of the cooking and farming furniture. There was never a time when colonists or citizens were generally boiling water in wooden boxes or clay bowls or bladders of animals, or digging holes for seeds with just sharpened sticks or shells. I mean, these certainly went on at different times. Not everyone always had their iron pots and farm tools, but when the people arriving on boats or in military companies or on farms thought about preparing food and growing food, they assumed they would be working with metal cooking vessels and tools. The most common cooking vessel was the cauldron, really, like think Harry Potter. And this would either sit over a fire or coals on 3 legs or hang from a hook or a chain or a bar over the fire. Because of this, one of the most common meals was stew. I mean, as it says in the book The Princess Bride, this was after stew, but so is everything. When the first man first clambered from the slime and made his first home on land, what he had for supper that first night was stew. Along with stew, there was porridge and pottage and pudding and many other things where grains or meat or peas with salt and herbs, if you were lucky, would be soaked or boiled or simmered into hot, nourishing things. There were clay pots and wooden bowls as well, but these were mostly made later. And clay things were more often used for storage than cooking. And since the early colonists were people on the move, iron pots were preferable as cooking vessels. They didn't crack or break and could be handed down from generation to generation and recovered when a house burned down due to accident or war. And this happened a lot because of the open fire nature of cooking and living in the 17th century. When the first 2 main groups of English people arrived in what was to become the British colonies, they both brought heaps of iron things with them. Some of them were steel, which is iron processed with a small amount of carbon, and a few other things I'm not going to get into. Metallurgy is one of the strongest themes of alchemy and is responsible for much of what survived to become modern chemistry. But more importantly for my purposes, it's a deep, dark infinity of rabbit holes that will just get me off track. And I know just enough about it to say things that are incorrect in the ways that make people who know metallurgy well really frustrated. Anyway, back to Jamestown and Plymouth. The Jamestown/Virginia first try was in 1607, and the Plymouth crowd, the Plymouth Saints and the strangers were the ones who weren't part of the Puritan sect from Holland, that first batch arrived in 1620, and both groups showed up with a big old pile of cooking and farming implements made of iron. From the very beginning, what would become American food used iron for both cultivation and cooking. Just as an example, Francis Higginson, who was a Puritan minister living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629, wrote out lists of the things a well-set-up colonist should bring with them. In the categories of farming and cooking, he includes 1 broad hoe, 1 narrow hoe, 1 shovel, 1 handbill, which is a kind of hook, 1 spade, 1 iron pot, that's the cauldron, 1 spit, 1 kettle, 1 frying pan, This would have been what is more commonly known as a spider, which is a pan propped up on a tripod of long legs, one gridiron, and 2 skillets. These would have been shallow pans used over the gridiron or propped on low coals. I posted photos of examples of these different objects in the show notes, which exist at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. And yes, I'm mainly using Blogger because I already know how to make Blogger work well enough. This link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOAFood and will also be in the show description. Anyway, as we work through the 17th century, we'll come back to Reverend Mr. Higginson's list. There's more on it. So why does using iron to cultivate and cook food matter? What's the big deal? Time and mindset. You can leave an iron pot at the back or side of a fire to sit there and stay warm. It doesn't need the constant watching of a flammable vessel like a wooden box or a sheep's stomach. It allows you to cook meat things for longer, especially in liquid, to get more nutrients like gelatin and collagen from the parts of animals that are otherwise pretty inaccessible to humans. For example, hyenas can actually eat whole bones. That's why they have that crazy huge jaw. These iron pots can also cook larger amounts of food. One big stew pot can fully feed 6 or 8 people, sometimes for 2 meals. Again, the boxes and bladders are just smaller vessels. And these iron pots are sturdy. Once you have one, you don't need to keep making it. Iron pots and other implements were handed down in wills or given as significant wedding gifts. In Martha Ballard's diary, the writings of an 18th century midwife in Maine, she points out that a wedding quilt and a cooking pot are the bare minimum a couple should have in starting out their life together. This sturdiness was an absolute advantage. But iron pots and tools could also be limiting. Using a set of iron cooking furniture meant that the mindset of the colonists was limited about what they could even see as food and how they got it. They had little or no foraging equipment or knowledge beyond hunting for meat animals, birds, waterfowl, fish, crabs, shellfish, and deer. They arrived with barrels of food shipped with them. And this food would be pretty typical rations. Salted pork and beef. Okay, probably beef. Probably mostly beef. I'm sure some of it was beef. Anyway, the salted beef for ship stores, especially when it was a cut rate trip like the Mayflower was, the salt beef was notoriously horse or mule or goat. I don't know. Okay, so some salted meat, dried salted fish, dried peas, hard cheeses, butter, and hard ship's biscuit. Flour wasn't great to ship because it inevitably got wet and was easier for the weevils to eat. And it was not uncommon to open a ship's barrel of flour to find it simply empty of flour and full of bugs. Blah. Okay, shake that image off. Anyway, these early colonists had in their heads what food was. You would hunt or forage for the fresh stuff, meat, animals, some herbs and greens, and fruits that grew wild. But for the majority of their carbohydrates and calories, the bulk of what they ate, they only saw what arrived in barrels or what they grew on their farms. The peas and beans and grains they used in their iron pot stews and puddings and breads as this sort of food. The diversity of tubers and roots that coastal Native Americans gathered and cooked and ate whole or made into breads and mushes stayed outside of their idea of food. This mindset and some other bad decisions resulted in half of the original Mayflower's passengers dying and just about every single Jamestown colonist from that first try dying as well. A big reason that 17th century iron pots helped focus the 17th century mind in a certain way was the expensiveness of those pots and the other tools. Every single one was still basically a one-off object. Hand forging and shaping and sand and clay casting techniques were still in use. There was no widely used method for making and using reusable molds. So each object was as handmade as you can get. At most, there might be a water-pumped bellows on the furnaces puddling the metals out of the ore, and possibly in the fining process. But every single step, from digging up the ore to cutting the wood for charcoal and all the iron processing and manufacturing, was done by hand. Every single cauldron, spider, spit, skillet, and the hooks and chains they hung from, along with the hoes and the other farm tools, were made one at a time. And really, until the mid-18th century, there was no facility to make anything of significance from iron anywhere in the Americas. There were a handful of short-lived ventures that made substandard bog iron, weaker due to higher impurities like sulfur, and it was mostly used for simple things like nails, horseshoes, and repairs. When the Revolutionary War got going, over 100 years later was the first time a large, permanent operation appeared in the British Atlantic, where iron ore was processed into pigs, then refined and finally manufactured into complex objects. Unsurprisingly, it was used to cast cannons to fight the British, something the colonists were unlikely to be able to import. Until then, every last scrap of manufactured ironware for cooking and farming came in on a boat. Part of the reason for this was because setting up an iron operation that can manufacture an object as technically complex and resource greedy as a cauldron requires a startlingly enormous amount of time and energy that takes away from food production, which really was everyone's biggest concern. Or it quickly became everyone's biggest concern. Jamestown rich boys, I will get back to you later. But the main reason everyone was getting their pots and hoes from England was that the trade in such things to the west side of the Atlantic was already established. The Portuguese and Spanish had set up sugar islands in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and they were getting some of their tools from the English iron trade. Heck, part of the reason England even started the colony thing was to make sugar. It was even one of the possible goals of Jamestown. The English got their first sugar island rolling in 1627. The islands and England were both expecting the sugar islands and later the colonies would buy all the tools from home. More on what was up with that mindset when we get to mercantilism. These were to be sugar adventures and later tobacco and fish and indigo and rice adventures. No need for other industry. So the Jamestown and the Plymouth groups had no plans to make much iron stuff. They were planning, from the beginning, to get all their pots and pans and farm tools from home. And they did. And after the hoes, they also got iron plows, along with the horses and oxen to pull them. Metal hoes and plows are faster at turning up the dirt, especially dirt that hasn't been worked for farming before. And you have to fix and replace them much less often than the wood or shell tools the coastal tribes were using for cultivation. Metal farm tools meant you were going to engage in a certain type of farming, one where you do much more to cut up the root mat of all the plants that hold the soil in place. The soil is open to much more leaching of minerals and organic material by the weather. This means farmers that use iron tools need a regimen in place to feed their soil. For hundreds of years, all successful European farmers had some sort of soil amendment regimen in place. Mainly, they composted their farm animals' waste, cows, horses, chickens, etc., and added it back into the soil. It was back-breaking work, but it was part of the plan and meant that as a rule, European farmers and larger landowners could rotate crops and grazing on their fields and keep working the same land year after year, generation after generation. And they largely did this because there really wasn't any other good farmland they could just move to. Between the other farmland being full or totally being owned by the local lord or absent royalty or the church, they couldn't just go get some other land. So they had to keep feeding what they had. And also, they had to know you had to feed it, and they had to know to do the work to feed it. Again, this was something successful farmers knew. But If you were a successful farmer, you were unlikely to want to do something as boneheaded as pull up stakes, give some money to a sketchy-looking boat captain guy, and go hang out in his stanky, dark, damp, rat-infested boat for 2 to 4 months, living off of hard salted meat, sour beer, and hard ship's biscuits, crawling with weevils, just for the pleasure of setting up a whole new farm with the bare minimum of community support. No thanks. I'll stay here with my 17th century feather beds, large manor kitchen, warm wool clothes, and a decently dependable supply of wheat, flour, and dried peas to supplement my farm output, which includes a whole bunch of dairy and eggs. Thank you very much. The settlers in Jamestown and Plymouth were mainly not successful farmers. They were a combination of adventurers looking for gold, I tell you, and the second or other extra sons of prominent families, those rich boys. And they were looking for free land in this magical, fertile wonderland of fish for everyone, everywhere, and soil so rich you could just toss out some seed and it would sprout up. I mean, seriously, the original crew in Jamestown had a jeweler and a goldsmith. Now, they did bring along some wives because, dude, cooking over an open fire is hard and takes literally a lifetime of training to be any good at it. I mean, I'm not up to making a pie if I have to start with a bag of wheat, a mortar, a pestle. I mean, it'd be a big one. Some eggs, a solid cone of sugar, some raisins, and a wooden bowl, a bundle of twigs, a pottery dish, and a cauldron. I'd likely do something a bit more common, like use cornmeal instead. Make a sticky dough, toss it in a tightly woven linen bag, and just boil me up a bag of pudding. Having some suet would sure be nice, though. Now, none of these people, when they realized they were down a deep, dark, empty food hole, they did not have the knowledge of how to run a good farm, and they had nowhere to look it up. Literally nowhere. The most common printed thing all of these people at both settlements had was the Bible. They might also have some maps, legal documents, accounts and treatises on religious doctrine, or letters about other people's adventures in the New World, giving them some descriptions and vague maps. But manuals on how to farm so you won't run out of food and die were simply not available to them. In Plymouth, there definitely were farm laborers, but most of the pilgrims were artisans and printers, townspeople, not farm owners. And the knowledge base of how to set up a whole new farm on the fly, prioritize the right work in the right time, especially in a totally brand new climate where you have no weather pattern data, is just not something your typical farm laborer, Protestant schismatic, or cutlass-swinging, gold-seeking adventurer or wannabe lordly sugar planter is going to know. So all of these people came with lots of tools and pots and pans and crates and so on, but limited knowledge, which shows that you need more than just the right tools for the job. Later on, by the second half of the 17th century, skilled farmers did start showing up. They often were making the trip because of a combination of religious dissent and the ongoing land and succession squabbles between the hopelessly tangled and inbred royalty of what we now know as France, Germany, and the former Bohemia, or the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and some of those Balkany areas. There were also some Dutch adventurers, but they were off doing their own thing, and they did bring farmers. So when the skilled farmers showed up and the people who survived in the first batches of colonists got better at farming, they were, A, able to feed themselves, and then B, as fast as they pretty much could, started growing and producing commodity food and other items for export. These products were all shipped back, mostly to England, so the colonists could get cloth, sugar, metal goods, paper, and all sorts of other things that were required to live in a civilized, that is, non-savage manner. And because many of these farmers were concentrated on first, not dying of starvation, and second, running a commodity farm for purposes of export, that other task of feeding and husbanding the soil, keeping the land healthy so it could go on producing, was not a priority. It got dropped. I mean, With the limited population and workforce, and everything being done entirely by muscle power, human and livestock, there was only so much they could do. And because these colonies tended to have money obligations they had to fulfill, and many people involved were also looking at making even more money, growing and shipping commodities displaced feeding the farm dirt. And so many farmers were using up the dirt, and then simply moved on to fresh dirt, literally mining the soil with their iron tools, using it up and moving on. Because why not? The land was out there, not claimed by any political entity they recognized or felt particularly restrained by. So these two starting conditions, metal cooking pots and metal farming tools, set the stage of how we cook and raise food even today. Most Americans do not cook in or on anything but metal. We may have some Pyrex or Corningware somewhere, but the typical American feels uncomfortable, even timid, cooking in a clay pot. And we may have a junk drawer with some bamboo skewers in it, or get some sugar cane or rosemary sprigs to cook chicken cubes on for that one recipe. But again, we mainly cook using metal skewers. And we still largely grow our food by using metal plows to open up the dirt to the rain and wind, blowing and washing off the organic matter, nutrients, and minerals. The pattern of using iron or metal generally to cook and cultivate our food was set by those very first 17th century settlements. I hope you'll join me for the next installment, where I will move on to iron and steel in axes, knives, swords, and firearms. I'll look at how access to those items drove how we acquired food and how we prepared it. And again, set some patterns that are still with us today. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode and the rest on into the future will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. I'll also include any interesting media I consulted for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.